Prynawn da pawb, good afternoon everyone, and welcome back to the Cymorth Cymru annual conference. I hope you found this morning's sessions really interesting and really thought-provoking, and I'm sure that this next session will be absolutely the same. So this is based within the context of our transition towards rapid rehousing, which we talked about in detail this morning, and was also referenced in our session on priority need. As we start the journey towards rapid rehousing in Wales, questions have been raised about the role of supported accommodation. Where does this fit in the context of rapidly moving people from temporary accommodation into more settled housing? What does settled mean? Does that include supported accommodation? Does it include some types of supported accommodation and not others? These are all questions that we're going to have to deal with over the coming weeks and months. In Scotland, an expert group has already examined this in detail, publishing a report about the future role of supported housing to prevent and respond to homelessness in Scotland. We're really pleased to be joined by Homeless Network Scotland Chief Executive Maggie Brünjes, who was part of this group and will provide insight into the discussions, deliberations and decisions made in Scotland. Please do engage with this topic through the Q&A to the side of your screens. We've got Maggie with us for an hour and we want to get as much information out of her as possible. So please do pose your questions to what is a really sensitive issue, but one that we do need to grasp and deal with here in Wales. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Maggie to come and deliver her presentation, and we'll answer your questions towards the end of the session. Thanks, Maggie.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you, Katie, and thank you everyone for having me along to speak at your conference this afternoon. I'm going to assume everybody can hear me and the microphone is working okay. I'm here representing an organisation called Homeless Network Scotland. We are a typical membership organisation that creates opportunities for a wider network to connect, to learn and to act on homelessness together. We're particularly interested in the policy and system changes that we think we need to end homelessness in Scotland. Now, my name is Maggie Brünjes. I'm the Chief Executive of Homeless Network Scotland, and I have been since around 2010. However, I've worked in and around homelessness for over 20 years. And within that experience, that includes time working within supported accommodation projects across different parts of Scotland. And I offer that early in this session because I know how important this type of provision, this type of accommodation, these homes are for people that have experienced using them and that provide this service today and that make that their home. So I guess what I'm kind of offering at the very start of this session is I kind of sense that I have seen a lot of this very up close. The great side of supported accommodation, the not so great side of accommodation. And through a lot of work that we do, which includes creating several platforms for people with lived experience of homelessness to be part of that big change that's happening in Scotland at the moment, that we also hear every kind of interpretation and every experience of supported accommodation from people that have stayed there, for those that it changed their life for the better, and for those that didn't have positive experiences at all. So I suppose where we were coming from at the start of this is that people have very different views on the role of supported housing as a response to homelessness. And I think where we arrived at amid that discussion was that everybody is right, is that all these all these experiences and all these perceptions are of course right. So what we wanted to do was to find our way through that, to try and offer a clear sense of direction in terms of how we move forward, define the role of supported accommodation in Scotland in the broader context of a transition to rapid rehousing, including housing first. So what I'm going to cover in my session this afternoon is I'm going to share the learning from a major piece of qualitative research that we commissioned on the future role of supported housing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the catalyst and context for that research, and finally I will set in place what the policy direction is. So what a kind of advisory group of key people representing different interests, experience and knowledge, advised that the direction going forward should be, and that's the direction that's now being implemented. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just start off by telling just a little bit about the story, I guess, of homelessness in Scotland, how we've arrived where we are at the moment, because it maybe just helps to put some of this in context, how this all catalysed this discussion. So very quickly, because this isn't a good history lesson, but for us, where a lot of our discussion started was back in about kind of 20 years ago. We had a couple of key acts in Scotland that set in motion the removal of the priority need test. And what that meant was that almost everyone had a right to housing. And we called that the 2012 target, so that by 2012, everyone who was unintentionally homeless in Scotland would have a right to settled accommodation. Now, what we saw over a 10-year period up to 2016-17 was, as a result of this kind of greater focus on rights and housing options, so there was a lot of practical work that framed these new rights as well. What we saw was a 40% reduction in the number of statutory homeless applicants in Scotland over that 10-year period, and also a 32% reduction in the number of those applicants that were assessed as homeless. We did start to see after that period was that the trend started to reverse, not significantly, but it did start to creep back up again. And particularly what we're seeing was more people staying longer in temporary accommodation, and that was despite those additional rights and the more focused housing options approach in Scotland. Where that took us was that rights alone is not going to solve this problem, that it needs us to consider it in broader and probably systems terms as well. And where the discussion started to progress to was an understanding that the homelessness system, as it was previously, was one that understood that while homelessness is something that starts in a community, all forms of it, that poverty is the key driver. But instead of rapidly supporting people within their community, what we did, of course, is we built a homeless system around them. And what we recognised is that that was often with different types of housing options than other members of the public. And I think this might sound familiar in kind of homelessness systems across different parts of the UK and probably broader as well, is that that system just became too layered and too difficult to navigate for people, especially, and too expensive for local councils to sustain. So we just kind of knew it wasn't working. And I guess what the whole objective round about rapid rehousing and housing first started to recognise is that, of course, we know which groups of people are more at risk of homelessness, that the distribution of risk is not random. We also know which communities are more likely to be affected too, and therefore communities with healthy housing and labour markets will just prevent homelessness earlier and do that closer to home. And starting to recognise the really close community connections and relationships and the role of that. All that meant just less time needed in temporary forms of accommodation to enable this system to start to shift forward. So what happened then was, in a sense, back to the drawing board. So I guess the successes at, at the turn of the kind of century, the early kind of 2000s, what initial work had put in motion, kind of took us back to kind of understanding what those next steps ought to be. So more recently, in 2018, there was a Scottish minister appointed Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, I think quite similar to the one that was in Wales recently, with a set of recommendations that were made. At the same time, in fact, it just preceded it was a cross-party inquiry in homelessness in the Scottish Parliament. Now, both those initiatives were major significant developments in the Scottish policy context, and both had kind of housing first, housing-led responses to homelessness as a cornerstone recommendation. So it resulted in a national plan to end homelessness, which is a joint plan between the Scottish Government and COSLA, which is the kind of umbrella body for local authorities in Scotland. And it also resulted in every local authority area in Scotland developing their own rapid rehousing, including Housing First transition plan. So that was a 5-year plan about how local systems would transition from that existing system that I just described into one that was much more housing led, reducing the temporary nature of homelessness responses, with a move toward more settled and continuous support for people. What this was also doing, these sets of recommendations of this new national plan and local plans, it was also better aligning housing policy in Scotland with broader health and social care policy and what the thrust of that was becoming. So there's a Scottish Government National Health and Wellbeing kind of outcomes framework that kind of underpins integrated health and social care services in Scotland. And already within that kind of policy, there's this move towards all people, including those with disabilities, long-term conditions, people who are frail, that the move is towards ensuring that people, where practicable, are able to live independently and at home or in a homely setting in their community. So that second paragraph there is a quote from that policy. So this is broader health and social care, not just homelessness. But what we were starting to recognise is that some of the living arrangements for people who come into homelessness through the homelessness routes, that some of those living arrangements that are available for people weren't as far as advanced as the types of accommodation that were available for people that enter wider health and social care routes. Where this set of recommendations was arriving at was a broader underpinning and a broader understanding in housing and homelessness policy that most of us, with the right support, can build and live our lives in an ordinary home and as part of an ordinary community. That previously hadn't been the starting point in the homelessness sector, although increasingly it was becoming a starting point in other parts of health and social care in our context. However, and this is what takes us into the much more detailed analysis that we undertook last year. What we also recognised was that for a small number of people, mainstream housing is not wanted. It simply isn't what people want at that point in their life. That might not be forever, but wherever things are at for them now, that's not what they want to be managing, or circumstances in which mainstream housing cannot be sustained. So in commissioning this research, which was undertaken by specialist housing consultants led by Anna Evans at Indigo House, we called the research Shared Spaces. And what it sought to do was, first of all, understand the circumstances of that small number of people, quantify the scale, and start to define what the alternative might be. So the qualitative research was led by a research advisory group. On the advisory group included homelessness organisations, supported housing provider, the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. We had local councils and connecting in with people with experience of using supported housing as well. And the qualitative component of the research also engaged in kind of one-to-one key informant interviews with 54 professional stakeholders. So that was right across council, housing, third sector organisations, including supported housing providers, people from across different parts of the health and social care, working in different types of roles in the front line, as well as more senior staff, as well as a range of kind of key national informants with an interest in housing and homelessness. So the exact same number of people with experience of homelessness were also interviewed as part of the qualitative component, so 54 people. Now, it should be noted that deliberately this was a group of people that were sampled who had experience of supported housing or who had indicated a kind of preference or a need or a want to live in some sort of shared housing. And that felt important because what we already had from research was a lot of people that knew they didn't want to share, but what we wanted to get a better insight into was those who did want to share or had experience of it. So that was the group of people that were sampled. In Scotland, it was a case study approach across local authority areas of Aberdeenshire, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Highlands, South Lanarkshire, Dundee. That methodology was deliberately chosen to enable different types of local authority areas with very different housing market areas, and also different kind of demographic profiles in terms of who's at risk of homelessness, and also a kind of mix of urban and rural. So it enabled us, instead of going across all 32 local authority areas in Scotland, just to get something that felt more sampled, but as representative as we could make that. Okay, so there's so much information that came back to those qualitative informant interviews, as you would understand, that they were long, detailed kind of interviews that were carried out by the research team at Indigo House. And just to share one of those quotes that came back, and that idea about somebody being worried that they think I'm okay sharing with someone else when I'm not, that I don't think they realise the effect that this has on your mental health. When I was waiting on the girl to come and was just worried. And it's, I think for us, a number of those types of, kind of quotes and testimonials really that came back from people, and just reminding us what that can feel like when supported housing isn't done great, when shared accommodation isn't done brilliantly. So in concluding the research and drawing out what some of the key findings are, and in framing the surveys and asking people what it was that they wanted, and what the kind of characteristics of supported housing they think are preferable, what the benefits and features of it should be. What we did was we purposefully defined shared as the sharing of bedrooms and or bathrooms and or kitchens. And when we framed supported housing in those terms, people do not want that. I mean, almost entirely, that people did not want that level of shared accommodation. Now, what we did in addition to that is we asked a series of other questions that tried to get to the bottom of what might be the circumstances then in which people might want to share. Okay, sorry, I'm just realising the slides on my screen. I can't see right to the bottom of them, so I hope you can. And if you can't, maybe we'll get the slides shared after. So I'm trying to refer to a second copy of slides that I've got here to make sure I don't miss the information. So the follow-up question was around, well, how about self-contained homes? How about something that maybe has its own bathroom, has its own cooking facilities? Maybe it's as part of a larger building and there's an element of maybe common space, or it might even be office space where some support workers, key workers or others are located. And that's either on site or it's nearby within the community. And the bullet that should be under there, I'm not sure whether you can see that or not, the research told us that some people do want that on-site support, and they particularly do want the support to be more arm's length. So something that maybe can't let myself into your room, something that's there for their sense of peace of mind and safety that they can call on while protecting privacy and autonomy of their own space, including bedroom, bathroom, and ideally their own kitchen area as well. Okay. Now, the next area that we were exploring was in what specific circumstances would that type of accommodation be best applied? Who is best fit for that type of accommodation? So that small number of people that told us they do want that type of shared accommodation. And what we did through a combination of these qualitative interviews, and also we did some data analysis with what's available through Housing First data sets and other data sets, is that we were able to start defining what the circumstances might best be. And this is described as these two parts here. So people who lack capacity, for example, to maybe even understand what that tenancy agreement requirement is on them, or the consequences of failing to meet its conditions. So, for example, the small number of people that we'd met through the Housing First Pathfinder in Scotland that couldn't sustain, even with the intensity of support that was provided through Housing First, that just couldn't meet the conditions of that tenancy. You know, for example, alcohol-related brain damages or severe learning difficulties. Now, the kind of other circumstances that we looked at were people whose health or social care needs just exceeded what could be realistically provided in mainstream housing. What was clear to us really is that a person could choose to opt out of a supported housing option even if they meet one of those circumstances. Now, there was loads of conversation around about this, and this will continue as we continue to move forward. So that idea that we can start to define the circumstances within which supported accommodation with on-site support might be best fit and for who, but that fundamentally who chooses. And that's that key point there about a person being able to opt out, who's had veto. And of course, that sits with the person. What we were using specifically in meeting those two, in defining those two circumstances, was some of the learning from the Heriot-Watt University's interim evaluation of Scotland's Housing First Pathfinder. Because what it really started to give us was new awareness and understanding of who mainstream housing, even as I said, with that intensity of support that Housing First provides, it just isn't going to work for people. Okay. Now, the second part of two, in terms of the circumstances within which this type of supported housing is best fit. The other kind of circumstances would be as something that is less a health and social care led response that we just reviewed in the previous slide, but something that is much more a housing and homelessness led response. So for people who don't necessarily meet those kind of very health and social care kind of elements, which is relatively high threshold, as well understands the kind of thresholds round about social care involvement, etc. And what we are still understanding within a housing and homelessness context is that there is a number of people that may not meet that threshold, but that still don't want their own place. And a lot of that could be aligned with the experience of homelessness that's been had, the length of time that people have spent homeless, what they're used to, the type of living that's become the type of accommodation that people want to live in. So it felt important when we were setting out the circumstances that we came at it from both that health and social care perspective, but also a housing and homelessness perspective. In the circumstances for people who expressly do not want mainstream housing, including Housing First, I've just told people that's not for me. Or people who expressly do want shared or supported accommodation. So for example, that might be the style of living that they prefer, or it might be a particular supported accommodation project that they've experience of that they want to move into or they don't want to move out of. And there was something very important that came through the research that also surfaced the very specific considerations for young people under 25 who may prefer shared supported accommodation. And I think what we started to do is to try and frame that as something that might be considered transitional accommodation rather than temporary. And that felt important to us as I move on to what some of our policy directions might be in terms of supported housing. Okay, so I'd like to move through just a couple of slides now just to describe when we asked people across all those kind of stakeholder groups what the key features of supported housing might be. So what would be the best examples? Okay, so across 3 different groups. First of all, when we asked questions around the physical environment, so first of all, people were clear that they wanted it to be self-contained, something that felt like their own home, something that was homely, and that really looks back very nicely to the kind of health and social care policy direction as well. Something that had really careful property and service design, something that really valued people's rights and independence. So something that didn't promote this type of institutional living, because that felt very against the grain in terms of housing, homelessness and health and social care policy. The idea of rights was particularly interesting as well. As part of the evaluation, the researchers had case studied a programme in Edinburgh that might be really interesting to look at, which is run by an organisation called Rowan Alba, and it's called Thorn Tree. And effectively what it does is it combines the types of long-term supported housing to the standard that we're describing as best in this research, but they also do it with security of tenure. So it's the only place in Scotland where they also offer a secure tenancy for people alongside that kind of arm's length on-site support. So it's really interesting, and it's a really interesting model to look at, and something certainly that many are looking at closely in Scotland and trying to see whether more in that style can be developed. In terms of the physical environment, the future, and thinking about a direction going forward, would want to break with that legacy of congregating people who are homeless together. So the idea, if we think about this at local level, at community level, that you could have some shared supported housing places where local people kind of took up residence irrespective of what door or what route they took to get there. So instead of being a homeless supported accommodation project, or one for people with addictions or one for people with disabilities, it could just be a place where people who want that type of on-site support could take up their home. Which links into the second point about it being community-based, and the idea of it being something that's integrated in the community, and a range of different routes to service. Okay. Again, apologies for the slight gaps. I'm trying to read off 2 different slides because, as I said before, I'm not getting the bottom of these slides, but I hope you are. And that just there's a bit at the bottom that just seems to be cut off. Okay, and finally, we are looking at the key features of long-term supported housing through a legal and financial lens. So what we wanted was to ensure something that maximises security of tenure, and I described a really good model in Edinburgh. Something that combines independence, safety, financial efficiency for the provider. So how can this be done in the most efficient and effective way locally? And particularly what we are looking to progress as a direction forward is something that could combine a really progressive commissioning partnership between housing, between health and social care partnerships, and looking at different combined funding models of rent with care and support costs, and how that might be met across those different partners. There was something really important that was published in Scotland over the last 2 to 3 years. It was the Hard Edges Scotland report, and there was a particular quote in that really resonated, which was about local councils carrying the can. Local councils, particularly the housing and homelessness departments, carrying the can for a whole series of missed opportunities earlier in people's lives. And this is really what we're trying to push here, this idea that different parts of the system need to connect together to jointly plan and commission and deliver these types of very specialist supported accommodation projects for people that want or need that. So the example that's given down at the bottom is that type of core and cluster housing model, which is care and support on site. So it feels like an individual home, and there's some sort of support in the same building. So it might be some shared common area, it might be an office kind of space, but somewhere where people can call on support if you need it. Sometimes there's other core and cluster models where that type of support is maybe further out, scattered somewhere in the community nearby, but again, close enough for people to feel that it is on hand if they need it. Okay, so the next part of the research was in trying to understand, okay, well, if that's the circumstances in which long-term supported housing is best fit for people, how much is it that we might need based on what we now know about people that become homeless, what it is that they want, what we also know about the experience of Housing First in Scotland as that key part of the rapid rehousing policy. So, okay, so our context in Scotland is that around half of the households who experience homelessness also have support needs of various levels, which means, of course, half don't. So half people become, that make a kind of presentation to the local authority for assistance with homeless, and half don't need any intensive health and social care support beyond their need for housing. Now, of those that do, what this research combined with that data analysis that I described did was estimate that around 2 to 5% is that type of scale of people that might be best fit for long-term supported housing. And by comparison, around 10 to 15% we think in a Scottish context is best fit for Housing First. So what this diagram in front of you is attempting to convey is, if we look at the top of the chart, the bit in lilac to the right is that half of households who experience homelessness that have no support needs other than the need for housing. Then we move into those that may have the need for some form of floating housing support. And I should add with that, in the Scottish context as well, is that those households have a right to housing support. And therefore there's a number of very important housing support services that are commissioned to meet that right that people have. And then in terms of Housing First, and we would see that's proportionately the next group, with a smaller group being that bottom kind of brick colour, which would be supported with on-site support. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, and if I can just finish up my slides with a bit of a discussion round about the policy direction. So if what that research enabled was for us to take a bit of stock to gather the views of over 100 people as part of the kind of formal qualitative key informants of the research, but also several hundred more by holding a series of conversations, events, discussions at conferences, presentations, focus groups, you name it, just to make sure that this is such an important part of homelessness policy that people believe in, and that it felt really important that anybody that wanted to say anything on the matter had the opportunity to do so. So all that was combined to set in place then a recommended policy direction. And I'll spend just a couple of minutes over the next two slides just setting out what that direction is. The position that we're at the moment is that there is a national planning group for homelessness in Scotland, which is called the Homelessness Prevention Strategy Group. It's co-chaired by the Cabinet Secretary and by the COSLA Community Wellbeing spokesperson, so the kind of political representative of that national umbrella group for local authorities. So they co-chair this national group, and what has happened this year as a result of all the policy direction has been a number of the big issues that remain round about housing and homelessness have been identified as needing task and finish analysis and attention. And by that, basically just taking a big chunk of it, getting more people round the table to surface not just the issues, but importantly, what the solutions are, what the way forward is. And one of those tasks, one of the 4 task and finish groups is taking forward the recommendations from this research. So it's just to kind of share, I guess, that the work that went into having this conversation and to enabling people to be part of it and to recognise the range of views that sit under it. That it has led us to a point that we feel able to start taking forward this policy direction in a way that most people would feel that they had an opportunity to input to. It doesn't mean that the conversations won't continue and that everybody's absolutely agreed, far from it, but at least it feels like we've arrived at a place where we can move forward rather than stay still, and that felt incredibly important to have reached that point. So just finally from me then, this policy direction as set out, what was being recommended is a new transformation programme in Scotland that sat as part of the transition to rapid rehousing and housing first, and which orientated supported housing as a settled housing option for a small number of people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness and who don't want or can't sustain a mainstream tenancy, including with housing first support. So it's a small group, those characteristics and kind of conditions as mentioned earlier in these slides. That what we are proposing as the policy direction is one that moves us away from supported housing as a temporary option and to meet temporary accommodation duties. So I'm not quite up to date with what the situation is in Wales, but Scotland, what tended to happen was that type of supported accommodation was used too often as a temporary response, somewhere for somebody to stay, rather than somebody that necessarily needed that level of on-site support. So it's about trying to make sure that as a resource, we can ensure that resources are directed toward creating the best possible form of supported housing for a smaller number of people. Okay, and thirdly on that slide, I'm not sure if you can see that or if that's cut off, but the importance of ensuring that when we move forward in this policy direction, that we do so in a way that considers the whole system at local level. And as I mentioned, just making sure that continued alignment with local rapid rehousing transition plans, local housing strategies, health and social care plans, all of it to avoid the unintended consequences. Now, for example, if we were to move some great supported housing away, you could be taking some important housing capacity out of a pressured housing market, for example. So the idea of making sure that this is an aspirational policy direction is something that is implemented in a way that is in step with the pace and scale of the overall transition to a rapid rehousing approach at local level. That felt incredibly important. And finally, we had a set of recommendations, which was about trying to position supported housing in a way that ensures its ongoing relevance in a system, as part of a system that really is fit for the future. And what we recognise in our context in Scotland is that there are some great examples across health and social care where it's already done really well. That kind of core and cluster model is done exceptionally well, where people have their own, their own contained living, own bathroom, own bedroom, own kitchen, but have access to care on site. Where that's done brilliantly, that really should be modelled and recognised as something that's done well across other care groups. Then that's as well as we should be doing it for people that come through the homeless route. And when we were looking for how we could kind of almost re-provision existing services, or in some cases there might be areas that don't have any of this type of supply in our context. Then we were looking at a number of different ways, including, making clearer referral routes for homeless households just to be routed toward existing health and social care commission services. Or it could be, for example, converting or upgrading existing supported housing that's used for people that experience homelessness on a temporary basis, as is currently used, and just kind of converting that to something that's more settled and more longer term. Or it may be, in some cases where appropriate, some new build modern supply could be commissioned by the Health and Social Care Partnership in partnership with strategic housing authorities, and doing that in a combined way to meet that kind of mix and diversity of need in a local area within a community somewhere, and not just as a response to people that have experienced homelessness. So that was kind of how we saw this panning out in Scotland in the future, something that is much more integrated, something that is much more a kind of health and social care response. Okay, and just if anybody's interested in getting some of the detail that sits behind those assertions, there is a couple of excellent reports. As I say, it was an organisation called Indigo House. They did a great job, and that's the qualitative research paper. So all the kind of detail, the interview tools, etc., are in there if you want to look. And what's also at that site is the kind of policy position. So there was a few key organisations of Scotland that came together as a result of the research through this research advisory group, and started deliberating in terms of what that meant, what all that evidence meant in terms of setting in place a policy for going forward. And as I say, we're now at the position where that policy is being figured through. So listen, that's me come to the end of my slides. I really hope you got to see the bottom of those slides, and if not, surely they'll be circulated after today. So that's us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That was fantastic. If you would like to join us on screen for some question answers, that'd be brilliant. Under the handout section of the chat bar, you should be able to get the direct link to the Homeless Network Scotland website, where the documents are available there, and we'll circulate links to it after the event as well. Thank you, Maggie. That was really fascinating, and such an important conversation for us to be having, and really benefiting from the fact that you've already started that conversation in Scotland. And I know earlier you were saying you wish you'd been able to look to somewhere else that had already started that. So I've got quite a few questions, but feel free, everyone, to submit your questions in the Q&A as we go through this. So I wondered whether there were different perspectives from people with lived experience, depending on maybe their own experiences, or whether there was a fairly consistent view about the things that they wanted.
I think what the research surfaced is the experience that we probably all have, is that different people have different experience of supported housing. Sometimes that is down to how supported housing is provided. Sometimes that is down to how the person receives it, and sometimes you can sometimes it'll be a combination of all that. I think what the research did was kind of almost consolidate that sense that this type of shared living is something that only a small number of people want, which is kind of what we were hearing. So one of the biggest pieces of lived experience and kind of consultation we did just as part of that homelessness and rough sleeping action group that I mentioned was something called I We Can. So it was a programme over 6 months that was basically gone out across all parts of Scotland, and we spoke to over 400 people that were currently using homelessness services. And the key message that was fed back through all those conversations was we don't want shared accommodation, So the sense that for most people this isn't what they want, but for the small number of people they do, they want it in a way that matches the way they want to live their life, is fair. And I think it's incumbent on health and social care partnerships, as well as local authorities and third sector partners, to create that type of space that people want to live in. If the other options that are available isn't an option that's going to work for them.
And that sense of choice, was that a difficult conversation to have sometimes with stakeholders? Because I know that in the research there's reference to choice, and then there's reference to some people who may not be able to sustain a tenancy, and that even in itself is sometimes controversial with people, because you take the approach of rapid rehousing where the underlying value is that anyone should be able to maintain a tenancy with the right support, and that mainstream housing should be the default, and there'll be a whole bunch of people that say there are some people who just can't do that, and many of us that argue that actually we're not getting the systems right if the person isn't able to do that. So was it quite an interesting kind of journey navigating those conversations around, to what extent do you place on choice versus, a judgment about someone's capabilities to sustain?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I think we went into this thinking, I hope this doesn't sound too much of a cop-out, but we did go into this conversation thinking everybody is right, because everybody's experience of supported housing is based on the lens through which they see it. And so people that deliver it, great frontline workers, supported accommodation managers, etc., will say, but we see people's lives changing as a result of staying here, and they're right. And then there'll be people that will use it, that will also have life-changing positive experiences. But then you'll go out, you'll speak to 400 people, and the vast majority will tell you this is not this is not what we want, So for us, it became about choice, but it also became about scale. So actually, we're all saying the same thing, and what we need to get into is what scale do we really mean? Because when you're talking about people that it's life-changing for, you're right, but it's not for everybody. If we agree, which I think most of us do, that most of us with the right support can build and live our lives in our own home as part of a community, that's a thrust, not just for housing and homelessness policy, but for broader health and social care policy as well. So if that feels right, then and if what also feels right is that some people have witnessed a great experience of supported accommodation, then the only possible answer has to be scale. It's numbers we're talking about, and I think what then the research for us did is back that point up by showing us that the number of people we're talking about is quite small. And so that kind of 2 to 5% that we arrived at.
And it's that tricky thing, isn't it, that by having these conversations about what the shape of future provision should look like, it's not at all about making judgments about, what is, as you said, the incredible work that so many people have done over decades, and you yourself have been part of those schemes and understand that transformative impact that it's had. But, it's quite difficult sometimes separating yourself and your values and the kind of pride that you take in the services that you've been delivering for a long time from what we want to see in the future and what would be someone's choice if they were able to make that decision.
Yeah.
There's I think what we're anticipating some tricky conversations in Wales, and there's no one settled at an answer. We may make similar decisions as in Scotland, we might make different decisions as in Scotland. It's very much an open question at the moment, but I guess immediately that springs to mind is some organisations, I think predominantly housing associations, who've got quite a lot of capital lending hold up in supported accommodation, purpose-built supported accommodation, that have 30-year lending agreements based on their business plans, and maybe are quite nervous about what this conversation could mean for them. And then also support providers who their sustainability as an organisation is often based on some of the revenue funding that is attached to these schemes, and that makes this conversation really difficult to navigate, isn't it? And did you kind of experience some of those tensions as you were taking forward the conversation in Scotland?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think in our context, something like certainly over half of the supported housing buildings are assets that are owned by social landlords. Some are owned by charities and a few owned by the council. So it suddenly becomes everyone's business. You're absolutely right. It becomes part of everybody's business model. One of the things that we did quite early, and we think too early, was start to think about the financial modelling round about that. And we were doing that before any of the other big discussions had been had. And actually what we looked at was some quite interesting models that we could perhaps look at separately some other time. But it was, for example, using social investment as a mechanism to convert, supported housing into mainstream housing for people that might be right. And there was some interest in that. But as I said, what hadn't been had was a proper airing of how people viewed supported housing, what the policy direction ought to be, and whether everybody was on board with that. So I guess our experience is it's an incredibly important part of the conversation, but it probably needs to happen in order. And I think the first part is, what do people want? Second part, people that support people, what do they know, what do they recognise, and what feels right? What can we all find out about scale? So if we've agreed there's a need for it, how much? And from there, well, how do we model this in a way that's going to be financially effective? And for us, the chief change that needs to happen in our context is about bringing health and social care into this conversation as commissioners and as planners and as delivery partners as well, rather than it being the council carrying the can,
Definitely. And was it easy to progress those conversations with health and social care? Because I think, there's budgets are tight everywhere. They have been for the last decade or more. I think there's too much demand on every area of local government health and social care than there is resources. So, how did that play out in terms of them kind of, picking that up and saying, yeah, we're going to pitch in and contribute to this?
I would say that conversation is exactly what's playing out now. So it's not an end. I would say it's very much at the beginning. So what we will see is pockets of great practice where health and social care are working with local authorities, housing departments to deliver things, including housing first, and looking at other types of accommodation responses. But in general, that need for greater integration across housing, health and social care feels quite fresh, feels that we're still quite early on in those conversations. And I hope that group that we talked about in the Scottish context will take that on as one of their big work programmes, but how we progress that.
So it sounds like a session at a future Commonwealth conference to me. I don't know if you're able to offer any insight into this, whether it came up at all, but was there a feeling that there was kind of different responses, or it would play out differently in urban versus rural areas? Did it feel like there's a different dynamic depending on that positioning?
Yeah, and what the kind of researchers were broadly finding is that people tended to drift towards kind of more to more kind of urban areas, looking for that type of shared accommodation if that's what they wanted. So those that did want that tended to move because the availability was just non-existent really in rural areas in our context. So just much harder for rural areas, the research pinpointed, to create that type of response geographically, I think as well as other areas. So yeah, it was definitely picked up as a dynamic.
Yeah, and in terms of particular client groups, again, we're embarking on this conversation, and there may be different answers for different groups. And you've mentioned within your presentation young people under 25, and that they were a group that was identified as one that if they chose to take that route, then the provision would be there. But I wondered whether there are any other groups that may not have made it to the final cut in terms of the research, but whether organisations supporting those client groups or people with lived experience were making a case that supported accommodation was more right for that group or less.
I think what we've identified is real knowledge gaps, and just exactly as you described, Katie, across different characteristics, different experiences that people have, and seeing whether we can draw out just a deeper understanding of what that might mean. Women, for example, was something that started to come through, but we know it needs more attention than that particular research could be given. I think maybe in some of those groups, that idea of considering transitional rather than temporary feels useful and something to hang on to. And whether that applies in across other groups or with other experiences,
Yeah, I think so. And we've been having debates in a couple of task and finish groups here about rapid rehousing and some of the language we use around settled, temporary supported, and what are the contradictions within that? What are the overlaps? How do we make sure that we use language where, people are clear what they're talking about and defining? And I think that kind of concept of transitional, where it isn't that very, very short-term emergency temporary accommodation, but it isn't something that's permanent, but it might be something that's right for the person for that particular point of time in a crisis or a combination of crises. So that's really interesting. And how is that conversation around language and where people see their provision kind of played out?
I think very similar. It all sounds very similar. And I think further there's been some kind of language around new duties to prevent homelessness in Scotland. It's introduced some further kind of framing around about how people are accommodated and how we describe that. I think the legal context is slightly different in Scotland as well, and not to get too technical about that, but it would mean that some of that language has specific legal meaning as well. So things like interim and temporary accommodation mean something in law, that other types don't. So you're absolutely right. Part of what we tried to do as a supplement to this research was iron all that out, and it's almost impossible. So it's definitely on the action list, I think, for a lot of us to try and find a way through that.
Definitely. And what was, I think you've maybe made a couple of references to this, but the value of having the independent research did that enable you to kind of feel more confident about the scale of the research that was done in terms of them having the capacity to do it, but also, I guess, that independence of, dealing with maybe people with very different views who felt that this agenda might be challenging?
Yeah, it felt very important to us that we went outside the sector to enable some independent research to be the thing that we can unite behind and to help us move forward. I think while we would see ourselves as neutral, and we all do, not neutral, but independent of thought, as in follow the evidence, we all do. And what we also recognise is that what we might be recognised as having is a role in relation to Housing First. And what we hear is a tension between Housing First and supported housing, as if in any way they're competing. Yeah. And of course they're not. And I hope what the Research Scotland did and what will happen next is something that can show them as absolutely not competing, but as a legitimate best option for different people with different circumstances.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Maggie. That's been a fascinating hour, and I could talk about this for several hours more. The good news for everyone is that we've got a meeting of the National Housing Support Network that ourselves and Community Housing Cymru run, taking place on the 26th of May, where we'll be continuing to have this discussion. As I said earlier, we're at the very, very start of this discussion, and there are no preconceived solutions or decisions that have been made, but I think it's really important that we have this conversation as we start that transition towards rapid rehousing. And as with many things to do with rapid rehousing, we can always learn lots from Scotland. So thank you, Maggie. I know you're extremely busy, but I'm really, really grateful for your expertise and experience and contribution today. It's been incredibly valuable. I hope to see you soon. But yeah, thank you so much again for being part of our conference today. So that's it, everyone, for day one of our annual conference. But please do join us tomorrow. We start off with Joe Hopkins from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Support Hub, who'll talk about promoting compassionate and trauma-informed approaches across Wales in different public services. We'll also hear from the National Lottery Community Fund and a number of support providers about their new multi-million partnerships to help end homelessness in Wales, working with people with really complex needs, with education and training, social enterprises, and with young people to help end youth homelessness. And then we'll finish tomorrow with our session on Nation of Sanctuary, welcoming and housing refugees in Wales, hearing about what has already been done in Wales on that note, and also what we can all contribute going forward. So I hope you had an excellent first day, and I really look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn.